to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth.
Well, hello, you good people, and welcome to Life on Earth. Whoop, let me do a quick mute here, get rid of that bit of echo. I think I would know better. Keeping a window open to keep an eye on the super chat. Hello there, and welcome to Life on Earth, on racism, on anti-racism, on none of the above, on Dilbert. This is a topic that I have been wanting to address, so thank you for joining me. This is going to be one for the ages. So we'll see how much trouble I can get in. Let's dive right in here. 3 weeks ago, I discussed What We Owe the Future by Will MacAskill, his book on futurism. You know, it was a big bestseller on the idea of long-termism. And among other things, I pointed out that Will MacAskill's thesis, and more broadly, the effective altruism movement, which he started, rests on nothing more than what he regards as a moral intuition. The premise that altruism is the basis of moral action. Now, this week, I have in mind to review Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. This is going to be good. And I did not expect that the two reviews of Will MacAskill's book and this book, I did not expect them to intersect or collide in the way that they do, so fundamentally and in ways that have been surprisingly eye-opening to me. And I started my preparations for this thinking, well, this will be easy, especially with Dilbert cartoonist Scott Adams in the news last week for his supposedly racist remarks. I thought, yeah, easy. It was not easy, but it proved to be enormously valuable. I hope you will agree. I'm going to jump right to the chat here because I want to hear what y'all have to say as we go along in this highly controversial, likely to get me canceled or at least thrashed a bit topic. Robin here it says, we shall beat the anti-racism with anti-racism. Thank you for that. If it can be done that way, that's exactly what we will do. Now, Scott Adams, creator of the long-running, enormously successful, published in 2,000 newspapers minus whatever he lost last week, enormously successful comic strip Dilbert. Scott Adams is in trouble. Adams has convinced himself that an earnest, honest, direct response to racism, including collectivist anti-racism, is impractical, and he's got to be much more clever than that. Sadly, too clever by half, as the kids like to say. In a recent episode of his video podcast series, the one entitled Episode 2027, Scott Adams, AI Goes Woke, I accidentally joined a hate group, Trump policing schools. He quoted a Rasmussen poll in which Rasmussen asked people, here's the question, do you agree or disagree with the statement, it's okay to be white? And he quotes the poll in which 27% of the Black respondents said, no, I don't agree with that statement. It's okay to be white. 21% weren't sure. Add them together, what is that? 48%. Now, I was originally going to read all of Adams' relevant remarks. And I looked them over, actually typed them out. And then I decided I didn't want to say those things on my podcast, not even as a quote. So I was just going to play the entire segment in question. Downloaded the audio file, started editing it. I decided I didn't want to do that either. So I will have some quotes, but I will encourage you, if you are interested, or just if you don't trust me to describe it accurately, or if you're a masochist, give it a listen. The link to the whole show, the whole hour-long show is in my show notes, in the description of this YouTube video, as well as at facebook.com/Robert Nasir. Adams pulls a shtick in which he says, and I'll quote him, I've been identifying as Black for a while. Given how that worked out for Rachel Dolezal, you would think he would know better than to pull that. Okay, back to the quote. He says, I've been identifying as Black for a while, years now, because I like to be on the winning team and I like to help, unquote. And then he states, given this poll, that he's going to re-identify as white on the grounds that he doesn't want to be a member of a hate group. Quoting Adams, he says, I had accidentally joined a hate group, because 26% of Black respondents answered on poll that they didn't support the statement, it's okay to be white. And another 21% weren't sure. So, obviously Black Americans are a hate group. Isn't that clever? No. But the worst of it is he follows this with advice to his listeners, and I will quote him. Please don't cut this audio snippet out and attribute it to me. I'm quoting Scott Adams, quote, well, based on the current way things are going, the best advice I would give to white people is to get the hell away from Black people, unquote. And there's more like that if you decide to listen to the whole segment. Now, if you know Scott Adams, if you know his blog posts and his podcasts, and if you know his comics and his other writings, you know this much about Scott Adams. He's not an idiot. It's clear from listening to the full YouTube video, and yes, I did listen to the full YouTube video. He thinks he's making a clever point in a clever way. And he's framing it in provocative and debatedly humorous ways. I declared myself Black. Black people are now a hate group. He's trying to cut through, not an excuse. Whether he's truly racist or is just so frustrated with the issue that he's willing to be provocative and risk offending people to try to shake people out of their current mindset. He said what he said. Now, personally, I believe he was foolish and reckless, and he said several vile things, and he should be willing to acknowledge that. You don't fight an evil by engaging in another version of it. You don't fight collectivism with collectivism. And sure, like a comedian, who says offensive things just to be edgy, he can claim it was part of the shtick. Fair enough. But he doesn't get to say, and his defenders don't get to say, and therefore you are wrong to be offended. See, Mr. Adams, you have the right to say whatever you wish, and others have a right to hear it and react accordingly. Your shtick is never a get out of jail free card or a don't hold me accountable card. In the end, this was not clever. It was stupid. And the results speak for themselves. In intellectual circles, in objectivist circles, well, we rightly decry cancel culture. We condemn doxing. We condemn mob rule. But this wasn't that. The response to this is something that we do champion. Vote with your voice. Vote with your feet. Vote with your dollars. But if Adams has gotten racism wrong, if he's gone full racist, don't ever go full racist, in the name of fighting today's culture war. Okay, what are we who care about reason, who care about individualism, who care about freedom? What are we to do? How do we understand the concept racism properly? Well, let me start with, oh no, I'm not going to start there. Let me start with Ayn Rand. I will quote from Ayn Rand's essay, Racism. Quote, racism is the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. It is the notion of ascribing moral, social, or political significance to a man's genetic lineage, the notion that a man's intellectual and characterological traits are produced and transmitted by his internal body chemistry, which means in practice that a man is to be judged not by his own character and actions, but by the character and actions of a collective of ancestors. Racism claims that the content of a man's mind, not his cognitive apparatus, but its content is inherited, that a man's convictions, values, character are determined before he is born by factors beyond his control. This is the caveman's version of the doctrine of innate ideas or of inherited knowledge, which has been thoroughly refuted by philosophy and science. Racism is a doctrine of, by, and for brutes. It is a barnyard or stock farm version of collectivism, appropriate to a mentality that differentiates between various breeds of animals, but not between animals and men. Like every form of determinism, racism invalidates the specific attribute which distinguishes man from all other living species, his rational faculty. Racism negates two aspects of man's life: reason and choice, or mind and morality, replacing them with chemical predestination. This from Ayn Rand's essay, Racism and the Virtue of Selfishness. Now that seems pretty straightforward and undeniable. To be a racist is to be anti-individual, anti-reason, anti-mind. But it's 2023, and we, all of us, black, white, men, women, all of us, are being told that we are racist by default, made so by the system which surrounds us, and the only alternative is to be anti-racist. Well, how can this be? So for answers, I went to the best source I know, Ibram X. Kendi. In his bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist, unlike a lot of writers, he lays down his definitions right at the start, right at the head of chapter 1 here. Chapter 1, definitions. Racist: one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. Slip something in there, but okay. Anti-racist. What is an anti-racist? One who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. All right, still quoting from the book. Now, what's the problem with being, quote, well, not racist, unquote? It is a claim that signifies neutrality. Oh, I'm not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist is anti-racist. Now, still quoting, there is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism, unquote. Now, if that seems extreme, let's not count Kendi out right at the beginning here. If that seems extreme, consider this scenario. Imagine you're a white guy and you're out to dinner with a black friend of yours, and you arrive at the restaurant, and a stranger insults your friend, specifically in regard to his race, using an ethnic slur. Do you shrug it off? Or another day, you're at the park with your kids, and they're playing with some black children, and some other kids come along and taunt your kids' playmates, again, with specifically racist language. Do you ignore it and shrug it off? Or do you confront racism when you encounter it? At least to condemn it, refuse to sanction it, and take whatever action you can to denounce it, to fight it. Now, to Kendi, most of the world of education, the world of business, the world of finance, the world in general, most of the world is in the state of that restaurant, that park, or that playground. And he's got the stats and endless examples and stories and anecdotes to back that claim up. And I don't disagree with the data. Now, a few more quotes from the book to make clear what is and what isn't being claimed. Quote, racial inequality is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequality between racial groups. By policy, I mean written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. One more quote, a racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior to or superior to another racial group in any way. Racist ideas argue that the inferiorities and superiorities of racial groups explain racial inequalities in society. Okay, that's not going very far, really. Let me jump real quick to Ibram X. Kendi's solutions. First of all, there's no one solution that's going to make this problem go away, certainly not in our lifetimes. But ongoing solutions from How to Be an Anti-Racist. Admit racial inequality is a problem of bad policy, not bad people. And this is a theme that recurs. Although we can judge people for their racism, it's not ultimately about bad people, it's about bad policy. Okay, back to the quotes. Identify racial inequality in all its intersections and manifestations. Investigate and uncover the racist policies causing racial inequality, and invent or find anti-racist policies that can eliminate racial inequality. Figure out who or what group has the power to institute anti-racist policy, disseminate and educate about the uncovered racist policy and anti-racist policy correctives. Work with sympathetic anti-racist policy makers to institute the anti-racist policy. There's more, but all of this seems somewhat reasonable. So to sum up in my own words, racism used to mean the holding by an individual, by some guy, of an unfounded racial bias and expressing it in words and actions. Now, to be racist means, and whether you agree with this or not, it is valuable to know this. So when you listen to these conversations, you know what is being said. Racism means insufficiently fighting, ignoring the society-wide impact of past racial discrimination and injustice. And yeah, the old style racism still counts as racism, but it's considered no worse. And in Kendi's mind, and he states this explicitly in the book, old style racism is actually less harmful than the average quote unquote non-racist who fails or refuses to acknowledge the broad systemic impact of past and present racial bias. He talks about racist conservatives, old Klan types down south, ignorant, and says they are not as dangerous, at least in terms of the cause of fighting racism, than somebody who just says, well, I'm not a racist, and there's nothing I need to do in regard to racism. Because you can fight the guy who's obviously a racist. What you can't fight is the guy who says, well, there's no real problem. We just need to wait for it to go away. Okay, fair enough. And if we interpret policy, and let's be generous, we want to be generous, at least at the beginning of analyzing any book like this. If we interpret policy to mean the policies of free private organizations, well, I could get on board with a lot of this. Now, in reality, racism, real, vile, individual racism, and systemic racism, the biases of many cultural and social institutions. These are two different things. And Kendi gets that. One is individual. The other is a broad set of conditions and circumstances. And it's crucial to make that distinction. But anti-racism is an unfortunate term in a lot of ways. And especially as Professor Kendi uses it, and here we go. Well, I'll get to why anti-racism is an unfortunate term in a moment, but I've got to say thank you to Mary Aline, who is in the super chat with several dollars to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. Very much appreciated. That is awfully cool, and good to know that you're listening. Got a few comments here. I need to go over some of them as well, but Free Trade, who's been a member for 10 months, puts in a super chat. Complimentary super chat for being a member for so long. Super cool. Says, does Kendi ever define racial equality precisely? If your goal isn't clearly defined, how can you ever hope to reach it? And Kendi, I don't know if it's in there as a definition, but he makes the point that equality would be if there was no inequality. So, for example, if you were to run the stats on Black mortgage applications versus white mortgage applications, or hires versus non-hires in different institutions, or educational outcomes, or 50 different dimensions in which he does refer to outcomes, he would say, yeah, racial equality will be when those systemic inequalities have been resolved. Let's see here. I'm just looking real quick to see if fortunately, there is a good index in the back of the book. But looking at the index, I am not seeing a quick answer to the question, does he define racial equality? Again, his point would be, it's when all of the systemic inequalities, all of the reasons why, if you took two identical people, one who happens to be Black, one who happens to be white, same level of ambition, same level of intelligence, same willingness to go out and work their butt off, will not achieve equal outcomes, will in fact achieve radically different outcomes. And again, I don't disagree with him on that. I disagree with what he attributes it to. I disagree with his interpretation. I disagree with his solution. So let's get to that. But thank you very much for that. Oh, Kindred Amy is in with a super chat as well. Thank you. And says, as an individual, reality-based and value-based, in an individual reality-based and value-based situation, I'm all about anti-racism. Have integrity and practice rational justice. Well, you're spoilering here, because that is going to be part of what I'm going to say toward the end. And of course, naturally, Kindred Amy is exactly right. And thank you for the super chat. Equal to Reality is also in with a super chat for £2. And thank you very much for that. And Free Trade is in with 50 krona as well. So thank you. I do appreciate the super chats. And this is a controversial issue. So especially during a show like this, in which I've got a lot to say, I do appreciate the support that you are giving the Ayn Rand Center UK. I'll say real quick, if you're not a member already, anybody listening to this show, find that link at the top of the chat, or just go to aynrandcenter.co.uk, click membership at the top, put yourself in for £9.99 a month or more. There are actually 4 membership levels. You could go as high as being a Reardon level supporter, Reardon Medal level supporter, silver, gold, whatever suits your level of commitment to the organization that makes shows like this possible. Either way, it is greatly appreciated. If you're listening after the fact on YouTube, you can do the equivalent of a super chat with a super thanks. If you put a question in the comments with a super thanks, we do read those later. And I do make plans, and I have so far, to answer those questions during one of the next shows. Thank you for that. And thank you for the super chats. Let me just scroll to the bottom, make sure I didn't miss any yet. Nope, but I am keeping an eye, and I appreciate the conversation as well. Ann M says, what's the difference between supporting their anti-racism and giving into wokeism? Let's talk about that. The way Kendi uses the term anti-racism, he conflates it with a willingness to confront and fight real racism, which of course Amy is talking about, and anti-capitalism. Wait, what? Well, you decide if I'm exaggerating. Here's a couple more quotes from the book. Quote, but it is impossible to know racism without understanding its intersection with capitalism. Prince Henry's Portugal birthed conjoined twins, capitalism and racism, when it initiated the transatlantic slave trade of African people. To love capitalism is to love racism. To love racism is to love capitalism. Capitalism is essentially racist. Racism is essentially capitalist. They were birthed together from the same unnatural causes, and they shall one day die together from unnatural causes. Or racial capitalism will live into another epoch of theft and rapacious inequality, especially if activists naively, and get this, especially if activists naively fight the conjoined twins independently as if they are not the same. These conjoined twins of racism and capitalism. So just when Kendi had me thinking, well, there's a lot in this book, and there are things that, maybe some of us who don't think about this stuff should be thinking about. Anti-racism as anti-capitalism? Addressing the ways in which our culture and our institutions still have discriminatory biases and practices from past racism would be far better served by using a different term than anti-racism. And no, Robin DiAngelo, not a kinder, gentler, less guilt-inducing term. We're not that fragile, but a more accurate term. Now, I have a super chat from Nick. Nick Artiega says, I'm seeing a rise in genetic determinism in the right. They will imply X race is genetically prone to Y behavior. I don't know if this is the case with Adams. I appreciate that comment, Nick, because when we're done, and I'll do it right now too, I'm going to answer the question, why am I even talking about this? And part of the answer, half of the answer, is that racism really is a thing. There really are still racists out there. Go to any conservative forum and read what they have to say about genetic determinism, about comparative IQ scores between different races, despite the fact that you will always find ways in which to interpret those that have nothing whatsoever to do with racism. There are still people who are quick to jump on the racist bandwagon, including people who will say, well, I'm not racist, them are just the facts. Like, it is staggering. So yes, Nick, thank you for the super chat. And you're absolutely right. It is still out there. And I don't know if Adams is falling for that kind of thing. You would think somebody with his IQ wouldn't. But those are surprisingly exactly the kind of people who are prone to this kind of thinking. So I'm not going to guess. It wouldn't be appropriate. I don't know the answer, but it's definitely the kind of thing you're talking about is definitely out there and in numbers that are hard to imagine in 2023. Marian Lean has a super chat, thank you, and says, how's he going to sell his book without capitalism? That's a great question. And the answer is it's 2023. And these are beliefs that have cachet. And there really is, or there really are, the kind of problems that he is seeking to address in his book. So how's he going to sell his book? The answer is, for better or for worse, he's going to sell it very, very well. Now, let me state a controversial opinion. We'll see if I can get myself canceled by the end of this. I can follow Scott Adams into well-deserved oblivion. I'm kidding, of course. The man has a comic in 2,000 newspapers. He lost 80 of them last week out of 2,000. Now he lost his distributor, but I'm sure there are other people perfectly willing to step and take on that role too. But let me state a controversial opinion. As I've implied, I do agree with one aspect of Ibram X. Kendi's thesis. And that is, there is more to racism than meets the eye. Specifically, there's more to be said than just, well, cut it out. Today's expression, silence is violence. For all of its foot-stomping immaturity, it can be interpreted as a contemporary version of Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s observation that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There is racism. There is quite a lot of racism. I shudder when I hear the stories of a friend of ours who left Motown not too long ago. A couple of friends moved from the Detroit area down to Tennessee. And it was just jaw-dropping and heartbreaking that they were just running into old-fashioned racism in numbers that you wouldn't believe. Anyway, that's anecdotal. The point is, firsthand, I can tell you, racism is still out there, quite a lot of it. And it's 2023. You would think we would be far beyond that by now, but that is not the case. Look, I want racism to be done, over, gone. But I'm not going to stomp my foot at reality and say, well, just get over it. But Professor Kendi, neither am I going to accept unearned guilt. So neither approach is the answer. It's easy for me, right? I'm white and male and dazzlingly good looking. Yes, I am speaking as intersectionally privileged, but nonetheless disadvantaged, notably for the widespread anti-shyness, anti-introvert, anti-intelligence bias. I've got my share of sob stories. So it's not enough to just be not racist. Okay, why not? What is the premise at work here? And the answer takes me back to the previous discussion of effective altruism. And effective altruism's founder, Will McCaskill, and his philosophic predecessor and inspiration, Peter Singer. In 1971, so that would be what, 29 years ago? No, I'm kidding. I still joke about the turn of the century. 50 years ago, Peter Singer wrote his influential essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Famine, Affluence, and Morality. It was published the following year in 1972. So 51 years ago. And in the essay, Singer introduces the drowning child argument. I've discussed this previously. Just imagine you're outside, you're enjoying your day, and suddenly, fairly close to you, you see there's a child drowning in a shallow pond or fountain. Kid's drowning. And you can easily save the child at some minor cost to you. Say, you're wearing a good suit, a pair of good shoes, so $200 worth of clothes, it'll be ruined. Now, to let the child drown, that seems ghastly and pretty clearly immoral, assuming, you can save the kid for the cost of some inconvenience and the price of your outfit. In his essay, Peter Singer says, quote, "It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbor's child 10 yards away from me, or a Bengali child whose name I will never know 10,000 miles away," unquote. You see, in this day and age, for just a couple $100, say the price of a suit and a nice pair of shoes, we have the means to save the lives of one or even several children in developing countries. Quoting Singer. Now get this quote. "From the moral point of view, the prevention of the starvation of millions of people outside our society must be considered at least as pressing as the upholding of property norms within our society," unquote. Now, speaking of good old capitalism, Jeff Bannister has gifted 5 Ayn Rand Center UK memberships. This is very cool. If you're interested in a YouTube membership, one just came up for you. You get a month of being a YouTube member free. And you're like, well, what's the YouTube membership? This is a way that you can watch, even if you're not an Ayn Rand Center UK member, you can watch some of the member-only activities that go on. Right now, we're studying the Fountainhead. The Fountainhead study group is always worth watching on Tuesday afternoons. But you've also got study groups on the weekends, on Saturdays and on Sundays. If you're a YouTube member, you not only support the channel, but you get access to those videos that are members only as well. So thank you for that, Jeff. Very much appreciated. Mary Aline is in with a super chat again and says, Ayn Rand called capitalism the cure for racism. Mary Aline, of course, is absolutely right. Ayn Rand, of course, is absolutely right. And we will talk about just how that plays out. So I've linked to the essay from Singer. It's not that long. You can actually read the original essay by Peter Singer that started all the trouble, that made the point. And it's included in his 2016 edition, which you can read on archive.org. I've also included a link to that one. And he stands by and he expands his original formulation. And before anybody says virtue signal, make no mistake, this is not virtue signaling. Singer walks the talk. He doesn't just, like many effective altruists, merely give away 10% of his income, like tithing. he lives very modestly, and he gives away a greater percentage of his income than just about anybody I know. Now, as I mentioned in the previous discussion, during a recent interview, Will MacAskill, Professor William MacAskill, was asked, well, your arguments for how to be an effective altruist are all very good and fine, but what if I don't choose to be altruistic? And MacAskill answered quite calmly, very matter-of-factly. He said that if you don't accept the premise that one should be altruistic, well, then you're simply throwing out the whole concept of ethics and leaving the conversation, and so there's nothing more to be said to you. Which is why in my podcast on the topic, I referred to altruism as a frozen abstraction. That's the archetypical example. Here, I'll read Ayn Rand's paragraph from Collectivized Ethics in The Virtue of Selfishness. She said, a fallacy which may be termed the fallacy of the frozen abstraction consists of substituting some one particular concrete for the wider class to which it belongs. And she says, for example, substituting a specific ethics, altruism, for the wider abstraction of ethics. Thus, a man may reject the theory of altruism and assert that he has accepted a rational code, but failing to integrate his ideas, he continues unthinkingly to approach ethical questions in terms established by altruism. For MacAskill and Singer and most contemporary intellectuals, altruism isn't merely one topic in the field of ethics. For all too many people, including Will MacAskill, altruism is ethics, and everything else is just working out the details. So, per Ibram X. Kendi, you are either an anti-racist, one who is supporting an anti-racist policy, quote, through their actions are expressing an anti-racist idea, or you are a racist, quote, one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea, unquote. See, to Kendi, it's either or. None of the above is not an option. You can't just sit this one out. You're either actively fighting racism or you are racist. Or he says you could be both, but you can never be neither. Now, per Peter Singer, ditto need, tragedy, starvation, pain, suffering. As long as you are not suffering and you have anything to give the suffering, well, by what right do you withhold it? The common denominator in Scott Adams' foolish remarks, in Ibram X. Kendi's worldview, in Peter Singer and Will MacAskill's altruism, the common denominator is collectivism, the opposite of individualism, the opposite of respect for the individual. Scott Adams is dumbstruck by a poll result and advises collective judgment and collective action. In his words, quoting Scott Adams, well, based on the current way things are going, the best advice I would give to white people is to get the hell away from black people, unquote. Ibram X. Kendi states flat out that society and society's systems are racist. And therefore, just by existing on Earth as it is, the individual is guilty. In his words, quote, the most threatening racist movement is not the alt-right's unlikely drive for a white ethno-state, but the regular American's drive for a race-neutral one, unquote. And Peter Singer is explicit in denying the importance of the individual and asserting the primacy of the collective, of the whole world, when he says, and I quote Peter Singer, can we really believe that we are living a good life, an ethically decent life, if we don't do anything serious to help reduce poverty around the world and help save the lives of children or adults who are likely to die if we don't increase the amount of aid we are giving, unquote. My answer to all of this worldview, collectivism, and consequently the moral premise, altruism, the view is wrong. It's just wrong. You can't ask, why not help? Until you've answered the question, why help? The reason to help, when there is a reason to help, is that it's in my interest to do so. The person suffering touches my life in some substantial way, even if it's just because they're drowning in a pond right in front of me. Well, they matter to me because they matter to me. The same is true if a friend or a colleague or even a stranger, but somebody I actually know or see or in some way connect with, if somebody in my life experiences racial discrimination, well, in that case, I have good reason to speak up, to intercede, to fight the injustice. There is simply no reason, and I mean that literally, there is simply no reason, moral or otherwise, that I am obligated to help anyone who doesn't have any impact on me, or at least on those I know and care about, on my own well-being. And neither should I matter to anybody else. I shouldn't matter to anybody out there unless I have some actual value, even if only a passing trivial value to them. If I fall on hard times, why should anybody in India or Spain or Winslow, Arizona care? Actually, there's a Winslow girl in a flatbed Ford who might remember me. Mary Elaine gives the right answer, if not necessarily the solution, and says, can't I just take my toys and go home? Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's a fair enough question, and I do appreciate the super chat. Now, I asked the artificial intelligence engine, ChatGPT, what is the solution to racism? And ChatGPT actually responded. ChatGPT says, racism is a complex social issue that has existed for centuries and has various causes and manifestations. Therefore, there is no single solution to the problem. However, there are several strategies that can help address racism and promote greater equality and social justice. And ChatGPT gave me 5 bullet points. I won't read the whole thing. Number 1 was education. Number 2, dialogue and communication. Number 3, diversity and inclusion. Number 4, political action. Number 5, empathy and compassion. Well, I'm good with a few of those. I'm good with all of them if I get to reframe them in capitalist terms. And ChatGPT summed up, ultimately addressing racism requires a long-term collective effort from individuals, communities, and institutions. It is an ongoing process that requires commitment, dedication, and a willingness to learn and grow. Well, not bad, ChatGPT. Not quite right, but better than most human commentators. Certainly better than Alice Cooper. His answer in the song Elected. I know we have problems. We got problems right here in Central City. We have problems in the north, south, east, west, New York City, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago. Everybody has problems, and personally, I don't care. Would that most of our candidates were that honest. But what is really needed to fight racism and to fight altruism, effective or otherwise? What is really needed is individualism. The knowledge, both personal and visceral, that sense of life certainty, and the philosophical validation and justification that your life is an end in itself. It is striking how a failure to regard individuals as primary, as the unit of value, as ends in themselves, leads to all manner of contradictions, as well as a morality of racial and altruistic original sin, which demands never-ending duty, sacrifice, self-abnegation as an end in itself. Individualism is the answer. To quote Ayn Rand's novel Anthem, quote, "I stand here on the summit of the mountain. I lift my head and I spread my arms. This, my body and my spirit, this is the end of the quest. I wished to know the meaning of things. I am the meaning. I wished to find a warrant for being. I need no warrant for being and no word of sanction upon my being. I am the warrant and the sanction." Unquote. Now, interestingly, Ayn Rand ends her 1963 essay on racism with a quote from the New York Times of August 63, which she says, quote, "Astonishing because ideas of this nature are not typical of our age." Unquote. Sadly, it's 2023 and ideas of this nature are still not typical of our age. Here's what the New York Times story said. Quote, "But the question must be not whether a group, recognizable in color, features, or culture, has its rights as a group. No, the question is whether any American individual, regardless of color, features, or culture, is deprived of his rights as an American. If the individual has all the rights and privileges due him under the laws and the Constitution, we need not worry about groups and masses. Those do not, in fact, exist, except as figures of speech." Close quote, the New York Times, 1963. Imagine that. And we have a late super chat from Apollo Zeus. Thank you for that. Says, "Sorry I'm late." That's okay. Hit the rewind button. Go back to the beginning of the show. No, just kidding. Wait until we're done. And man, we're running long. We are almost done. I want to say thank you for listening this long. This is important. This is important stuff to me. I've been wanting to review this book. Now I know what Ibram X. Kendi actually says. And now you know what Ibram X. Kendi actually says. I wouldn't say don't read the book. It's a good idea just to get an idea what the data is, what the evidence is. And the fact that he interprets it in the way that he does is a challenge to get through. But even that provides additional information. Glad that I had this opportunity. One more call out, any more super chats will be appreciated. They all go to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. I do appreciate the support you've given already. Anybody listening after the fact, your super thanks are always appreciated as well. Thanks again to Jeff Bannister for giving out those free accounts to folks. Try it out for a month, see what it's like to see things from the inside. And go to AynRandCenter.co.uk. Always got to remember those overseas TLDs or top-level domains. And thank you for your support. Now, why discuss racism on Life on Earth? Isn't this show usually an oasis of positivity? Because racism, real racism, and anti-racism to the extent as in Kendi's case, it is anti-individualists, stands in the way of all manner of human values, including trade and cooperation and benevolence and admiration and friendship, and in my case, family, and generosity. And if the fight against racism has any value, it is the value of justice, of respect, of honor, of love. So I have fought, and I do fight, and I will fight racism, real unfairness, real injustice, when I can and when I should. And I know most of you will too, not as a sacrifice to the cause, but because life is too short, and good people of all races are too precious. And because racism has no place in life on Earth.